So before incising into the clay for the Mishima technique, I've gone ahead and I've planned out a design. And I find this is helpful so that I can anticipate the line spacing and the direction that I will be working. And just having a plan is helpful. I know some people prefer to work intuitively, but if you haven't planned ahead, I would say give it a try. There's this motif that I've used on other projects using different techniques, different surface design techniques. So I thought I would revisit this design, but modify it a bit. So in this particular design, there are these pointed petals and a smaller version of the flower form on the right and these vines with leaves. I've picked that up, but in this design, I've made the petals larger. The leaf pattern is still the same, but I've added a border. So I have my design ready and my clay ready, and I'll double check my clay before I begin. The design I chose does have straight lines and also some rounded shapes, so I could go over the tools that I would recommend for those types of different lines because they do have a different quality to them. So as always, I'll test the clay. I want it to be leather hard. I also don't want to be picking up any clay on my finger. I'm not picking up any clay. Good to go. For the Mishima technique, first I will incise the clay and then apply the underglaze. In this case, I'll be using underglaze, but we can use underglaze, slip on go through the various steps. And then I will go ahead and stamp the clay and repeat the process, just so you can see the difference. Before I begin, I will smooth the surface of the clay. And there's a variety of ribs you can choose from. So you may decide you want to incise directly into the clay, or you may want to draw your design onto your clay first and then go in with your incising tool. I recommend, if you haven't done this before, it's not a bad idea to draw it in lightly with the pencil. And then do know that even though you're drawing lightly in with the pencil, sometimes you do actually incise into the clay, which is fine because you can just easily rub that away. I'm going to go ahead and lightly draw my design into the clay. So the nice thing about this is that if I didn't like this line or some part of it, I could just rub that away. And even if I had incised into the clay, it would be easy to rub that away and start over. Or I could take my rib and smooth it out. So it's a lot easier than if I were to put pressure in with an incising tool. You are still able to correct that. It's just so much easier if it's a light line with a pencil. So if you're just starting, pencil would be fine. If you feel you're fine to jump in with the ball stylus or the loop tool, then begin with those tools. So in my design, I have a lot of straight lines. I'm not so concerned with having them evenly spaced, and by that I mean precise spacing. I do want to mention that when you're first starting with this, you may want to have thicker lines. When you start to do thinner, fine lines, maybe using a tool like this, which I love using the fine lines, but with Mishima, you want to have enough space for the color to get in and out of the recessed areas. So wider lines will help achieve that. Real quick, I'm going to go over this with an incising tool, and then I think the rest of the way I won't be drawing the design. I'll just go in with the tool. So for straight lines, using the loop tool, something like this or this will work really nicely. Be sure to view the video on incising tools for helpful information. I want to make sure my lines are not too shallow. There needs to be enough of a recessed area for the color. These larger lines right here, I'll wait till the very end and then everything will connect. It's important to know that when you're incising, where lines meet and intersect, for some reason there's a tendency to lift up with the tool. So you want to make sure that you're going right to the line, and before you add color, you'll double check where lines meet and intersect. Another thing I want to mention is you notice as I'm carving through that these little pieces of clay are little loops. That lets me know that my clay is at the leather hard stage. If these little pieces of clay were little chips or fragments, then it would be an indication that the clay was a little too dry. So I went ahead and finished up with the other lines. And now I'm going to go in with a larger loop tool and create those lines that frame it. I've gone ahead and incised the vertical lines. And I went ahead and also started the flower form. With the flower form, I went in with the ball stylus. If you view the incising video, I go over how the loop tool is great for horizontal and vertical lines, angles, and the ball stylus is great for spirals, circles, round forms, free-flowing forms. The tool just glides much easier. Basically what I'll do here is the same that I did with this bottom portion of the flower form. And I want to make sure that I leave enough room for the vines and leaves. So and I will want to go over this design twice because I want to make sure right here where lines meet and intersect that it's a clear path. Okay, so now I've gone ahead and added the vines, and here are the vines in the sketchbook, and here they are on the piece. I did end up changing the number of leaves, and that's something that'll happen. You'll have your sketchbook, so you go from your concept to your design to the fabrication of your piece, and sometimes you will find that you decide to modify. And so I modified by removing a few of the leaves from the original sketch because I wanted to make sure that I had thick lines, enough room within the lines so that the color can flow in and out of these recessed areas. So next I'm going to apply the color onto the surface. I'm going to apply blue on the surface of the clay, and I want to make sure that it goes into the recessed areas. Finished applying the underglaze onto the piece, and now I will wait for it to get from a shiny reflective surface to a dull surface before I apply a second coat. Usually, depending on the product you're using, and always check the manufacturer's recommendations, you'll want to apply 2 to 3 coats. Depending on the product, when you're firing high fire range, specifically cone 10 stoneware, that a lot of times when you're using a blue or a black, again, depending on the specific product, sometimes if you have 3 coats, it will melt and blister, or it can attach itself to the glaze and run. So run a little test, or you can safely put 1 to 2 coats. I would say more 2 coats because you want it to be opaque. We see here that it's already starting to dry in certain areas, but we want it to dry a little more before we put the next coat. The surface is no longer looking shiny. It's now looking dull, so I can go ahead and apply a second coat onto the piece. Another thing I'm doing as I am applying the underglaze is making sure that I'm not going back and forth like this. When you go back and forth, you risk the chance of disturbing the layer underneath. And then since the clay is still at the leather hard stage, it can also start to move around, and then you'll end up with a muddied surface. So now I'll let that dry. Once again, it's no longer a shiny surface and now a dull surface, and this would be the right time to begin to remove the color so that it's only staying in the recessed area. And I'm just going to do some in a little area right here. And we see that the color is staying in the recessed area. So in this area where the lines are horizontal, I'm going to go in a horizontal direction. If I were to go in this direction, then I'd smash the clay and smear the clay over the colored area. So really try to go, when possible, in the direction. Have a sponge nearby to clean your tool. And we see the vertical lines starting to appear. And here we know we have the vines and the leaves in the flower form. And the design is starting to show through. So I will continue. I'm going to go over the whole area generally, and then I'll go back and clean it up a little more. This is where I had the vertical stripes, so I'm trying to go in the vertical direction here. And I'll continue cleaning these areas. When finished, cover for at least 24 hours, then let dry. Next, I will demonstrate the Mishima technique on a stamped surface and point out the differences and considerations when stamping versus incising onto the clay. When using a commercial stamp, when pressing down into the clay, the impression should be relatively even. Once again, you want to press and then move around, and that will give you a nice even stamped surface. When you're working with handmade stamps, as in this one, you see that there are different layers of impression on the stamp. That's something you'll need to consider once the impression is in there, that there are different levels when you go to scrape away the color that you've applied over the impression. I'm going to impress some horizontal stripes on the side as a border. So I'll press in Now right here, I put a little more pressure than I wanted to. And again, I have to be careful that I don't go too deep, because then when I go to scrape away the color, these little lines here might not show up. Now I will add another series of horizontal lines. And now I have this other stamp with the flower form that I wanted to use. There's variation with thick and thin, and when I go to remove it, I'm not going to be so concerned with making sure that every little aspect of the stamp is revealed. So we'll get to that part after I apply the color and then start to reveal the impressions underneath. So now I will apply the underglaze. And this time I'm using a fan brush. And so, once again, I usually use a hockey brush for high fire and a fan brush for low fire. They're very, very similar. So most of the pieces started to dry nicely. It's going from a shiny, reflective surface to a dull matte surface, except for there are still some little areas here where it's shiny. So I'm going to wait until the entire piece has that dull matte surface. I'm going to go ahead now and apply the second coat. Make sure I'm getting into all of these little crevices. The whole point is we want to inlay the color into the recessed surfaces. Ideally, I just want to go across it once. So as far as application of the underglaze or engobe or slip, always follow manufacturer recommendations. There are some products that say they will go anywhere from low fire, 06, 04, all the way to high fire, cone 10. And I mentioned before that with some of the products in blue and black at the high fire cone 10 range, they will go ahead and either blister or attach to the glaze and run. So in this particular case, you're probably better off going with 2 coats. And I did mention that earlier. I just wanted to mention that again here. So these little areas here still need to dry out a bit more, but this area here is ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and begin. And by the time I'm done removing the color from these areas, this central area should be dry. So I'll start here. Actually, I'm going to use the flat part of this rib, and I'll show how this rounded part will come into play in a little bit. Now I like to go in the direction of the impression, so now I'm going to turn my piece around. And the clay is still leather hard, so I have to be careful not to dig in too deep and distort the impression. And now I'm going to use this little high point right here. And I have a little sponge and I'm wiping the clay onto the sponge. Notice it is leather hard. We don't want it to be dry and be breathing clay dust. So now I'm going to go in this direction, and I am using this high point because these lines are a little bit lower than the rest of the stamp. So then I have a high point that's hitting the rest of the design. And I don't need to be so exact the first time around. I'll come back. Again, important to clean your tool. If not, what you're going to do is rub some of the color into areas where you want to be removing it. So there we can start to see that the impressed design is being revealed slowly. And I will be going in and using that high point too. And I'm going faster and covering a larger area, but I still have to be very careful not to put too much pressure because the clay is still leather hard. And just to show you that the clay is leather hard and I'm not scraping on dry clay, here's a little piece where maybe I scraped just a little too hard and I picked up some of the clay as well. So that happens, but I'm being very gentle about it, so it's not going to really disrupt the design or anything else that's happening here. But what I wanted to show is, once again, had I used a commercial stamp, everything would have been even. But I intentionally used a handmade stamp where, you know, there's variations in the depth of each one of the lines. So what do you do if you have this happen? And that's where having kind of a rounded rib will come in. So we see through the first go around that I've hit all the high points, but then there's some other little recessed areas where there's texture, and then we'll go back in and remove the color from those. I'll just do a little more here. And we can see that it's starting to get more and more defined. So more progress, and I want to be moving quickly because I don't want my clay to dry out and then I'm scraping the clay. High fire clay, if the clay starts to dry, then you're dragging the sand and grog along the surface and it can leave this little scrapey kind of surface on the top of the clay. This is not so much of an issue if you're working in low fire clay or porcelain. So I want to keep it at leather hard. I want to move quickly so that it's not drying, but at the same time I want to be very careful, because it's leather hard, that I'm not scraping off more than I need to be scraping or distorting the impressed design. So I've taken off the top layer of color on the clay, and now the recessed areas, the incised areas are revealed. So we see that what's nice about using a handmade stamp is that when I impress into the clay, there can be a lot of variation in the design, which can be visually interesting. For example, with this handmade stamp, because the depth of the lines vary, it's already going to have a different impression into the clay. The amount of pressure I apply when I press into the clay will also affect the design, with some areas being a little more shallow and some areas being a little deeper. And then when I went in to remove the color, that also affects the design and line quality. In some areas, I may scrape off a little more, or if I'm going in a different direction, that can affect how much of the color is removed. So this allows you to have a lot of variation, even though you're using the same stamp, which would be a lot different than if you used a commercial stamp, where the design ends right here and you press and everything's going to be uniform and exact. So let's review. So these are two examples of the Mishima technique. One where the design was incised, and the other one where the design was stamped. Color was placed over both and then removed to reveal the design underneath. In conclusion, there are so many possibilities with the Mishima technique. There are possibilities with the tools that you may use, the techniques, incising or stamping, the colors you choose. So many ways to explore. I hope this has provided some information that will encourage you to explore the Mishima technique and all the various possibilities.